we'll give just a couple more minutes for folks to get here. I know moving between sessions is sometimes a longer process than anticipated, so. So we're just waiting a couple minutes. Hopefully some more folks will trickle in. But just so you're aware, we are going to be live streaming this. Nobody in the audience is going to be on the live stream, but just so everyone's aware. And I might be repeating back what you're saying so folks who are watching can see. So for folks who are in here, there is going to be a small group discussion portion. So if the folks who are at a table by themselves want to reposition themselves, they can. Otherwise, you can just do it on your own. Well, I think we should just get started. So, my name is Isabel Connors, and I'm going to be presenting on the criminalization of sex work as a human rights violation and a labor rights violation. So I'm here representing Project SAFE, which is a Philadelphia grassroots direct service and peer-based advocacy organization, and it's run by individuals who are in Philadelphia's sex trade. We service femme-identified folks who are a part of the street economy in Kensington, or on Kensington Avenue. So some of the services that we offer are outreach. We walk down the Kensington Strip. We have safer sex supplies, which include condoms and include wipes and things like that. And we have insertive condoms as well as receptive condoms. We also offer safer injection kits with clean needles and clean supplies for those who do use IV drugs. We offer deliveries, so we have point people within the community who will actually get a big bunch of supplies, including Narcan, and then those supplies will be disseminated throughout the community by people who are part of that community. We also offer Ladies' Night and Community House. This offers an opportunity for folks that we serve to get a hot meal, have a shower, clean up. Sometimes we have clothes that we can donate as well as toiletries. And we also do advocacy and education. So we provide human service professionals with trainings as well as do political activism within Philadelphia. All right, so our presentation objectives for today, we are going to, by the end of this, you're going to be able to explain basic information regarding how sex workers are criminalized in the United States, specifically in DC and Pennsylvania. I do want to give a caveat that I don't have a legal background and I'm not a legal professional. So the information that I'm providing is information that I've gained through research as well as interactions with folks who are directly impacted by these laws. So you'll also be able to identify specific ways in which this criminalization creates a barrier to human rights and labor practices. And finally, understand better practices and policies that promote human and labor rights of sex workers. All right, so for the focus and scope of this presentation, we're really going to be focusing on a few different areas. Like I said, I'm from Philadelphia, but I did do a little bit of research on DC just because that's the area that we're in. So we're going to be focusing on criminalization of sex work under prostitution law and sex trafficking legislation. So in DC, Pennsylvania law, as well as some federal legislation that I'm sure many of you have been more familiar with since either attending or previous to this. We'll also be talking a lot about the impact on marginalized communities. So I'm obviously, well, not obviously, but I am a cis white woman, and so I think that it's important to raise voices of folks who are impacted by this, but I recognize that I am in a significant position of privilege while I do this. So if there's any time that folks want to add to what I'm saying or question what I'm saying, I'm totally fine with that. So some of these communities are sex workers of color, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming workers, low-income workers, sex workers with disabilities, and homeless workers. So in terms of theoretical frameworks, we're working from two different frameworks here. The first is a human rights framework. So this stipulates that all people deserve to live with dignity, freedom, and an ability to meet their fundamental needs. And some of these rights include, that we'll be talking about today, our rights include housing rights, employment rights, health care, as well as safety. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs stipulates that to fulfill one's full potential, you need to have your basic needs and psychological needs met. So I think that that really ties in well with what we're hoping for sex workers. Sex workers, like all people, deserve to have these needs met. The other framework is a harm reduction approach. So this is an evidence-based approach that seeks to minimize the risk of societal and physical harm associated with various human behaviors. This is often used for recreational drug use and IV drug use. And this model preserves dignity and compassion for individuals who are engaged in certain high-risk behaviors. It is also a client-centered approach that takes into consideration the person's own needs, desires, and goals. All right, before we can talk about criminalizing sex work, we need to understand what sex work is. So sex work is different from sex trafficking. Sex work is specifically about consensual exchange of sexual services for money or goods. And some of these services can be full service work. It can be erotic massage, professional domination or submission, stripping, go-go dancing, camming, porn acting, sexual surrogacy, phone sex, to name a few. So how are sex workers criminalized? They're criminalized in a variety of different ways. So prostitution law is obviously a big one, but police enforcement of other laws when they're targeting sex workers is also a huge way that this community or these communities are impacted. Criminalization of HIV and AIDS is a significant way that these populations are also criminalized, as well as sex trafficking legislation. Specifically, we're going to be talking about SESTA FOSTA and how that is impacting sex workers, as well as child endangerment laws. So criminalization in DC specifically. So prostitution law in DC, DC prohibits engaging and soliciting for prostitution, and their definition of prostitution is any sexual act or contact with another person in return for giving or receiving a fee. And soliciting is defined as inviting, enticing, offering, persuading, or agreeing to engage in prostitution. So still pretty vague definitions, and they are not enforced equally across the board, and of course are impacting marginalized communities more than communities of privilege. In DC specifically, but this is the case all over the country, gentrification has had a huge impact on sex work legislation. So attempts to clean up the city have resulted in problematic and dangerous legislation targeting street-based sex workers. So this includes the creation of prostitution-free zones, which I've been told goes back and forth in DC, but this is a strategy that has been attempted, and there have been serious impacts of this. Also creating condom limit policies, limiting the number of condoms a person can carry on them and using an excessive number of condoms as proof of prostitution. So the impact of things like this are that it creates higher penalties and longer jail time for individuals who are convicted in prostitution-free zones. And if they are practicing a move along policy where a police officer says, hello, this is actually a prostitution-free zone, you need to move elsewhere. If you're forcing a person to move elsewhere and they are unfamiliar with that area or that area is dangerous for them, that's not solving a problem. That's just creating more violence and dangerous situations for sex workers. And workers are less likely to utilize harm reduction techniques, such as using condoms, if having condoms on you is used against you in the court of law. Some law enforcement tactics in DC are perceived, and that's important. So it's not just folks who are sex workers, but it's also folks who are being perceived as sex workers, which, again, is oftentimes impacting specifically Black trans women and other folks of color, as well as homeless folks. So if they're unable to prove that a sex worker is being charged with solicitation or failure to obey, they can use other laws such as jaywalking, disorderly conduct, and trespassing, and charge them with those violations instead. Brothel and massage parlor raids and sting operations have also been used in DC. And indoor workers are charged with receiving money for arranging prostitution, as well as operating a house of prostitution. So in 2007, there was a study done on the policing of sex workers in DC specifically. And this was a qualitative community-based research study by the Alliance for a Safe and Diverse DC. The findings were, unsurprisingly, widespread and entrenched patterns of police abuse and mistreatment of people that they profile as prostitutes. The majority of participants reported negative experiences being approached by police, and only 50% of these participants were actually engaging in sex work. But they include humiliation, verbal abuse, extortion, strip searches, assault, and confiscation of safer sex supplies. So criminalization in PA, which admittedly I'm a lot more familiar with than DC. Prostitution law in Pennsylvania. Under Pennsylvania law, a person commits the crime of prostitution by either engaging in sexual activity for money or loitering in a public place or in view of a public place for the purpose of being hired for sexual activity. So again, these are very vague and very subjective and ways that really depends on the officer who is in the area and how they're going to treat individuals. So another really scary aspect of DC law is the criminalization of HIV, or people who have HIV. So there are multiple ways, but there are two ways in which this specifically impacts sex worker communities. The first is prostitution while HIV positive. So prostitution-related charges are misdemeanors in Pennsylvania unless the person is HIV positive and should have known, if not knows, that they are HIV positive. If that's the case, they are charged with a felony, and that can result in up to 7 years in prison. Also, assault by a prisoner. So individuals who are incarcerated, if a prisoner with HIV and AIDS knowingly causes another person to come in contact with their bodily fluids, they can face an additional 10 years, regardless of actual HIV transmission or the possibility of transmission. So an example of this is in 2010, an HIV-positive incarcerated woman was charged with assault by a prisoner for spitting at another prisoner. Folks here probably know that you cannot contract HIV through saliva, and she just spit at her and was given an additional 10 years to her sentence. So what is the impact of criminalizing HIV and AIDS? It exacerbates the stigma and discrimination against HIV-positive sex workers. It disincentivizes sex workers from getting tested and knowing their status. HIV-positive sex workers are less likely to use harm reduction techniques such as disclosure for fear of being charged with prostitution while HIV positive. Because if they disclose, then that is a sign that they knew they were HIV positive. If incarcerated, there is reduced employability, social isolation, and psychological distress. And consequences of having a felony charge in Pennsylvania include prohibiting employment opportunities in areas such as nursing and education, low employability due to criminal history. You have to tell them if you have been convicted of a felony. Denial of state licenses for professional occupations, including architecture, physical therapy, and crane operators. Disqualified from state and federal benefit programs such as higher education loan assistance programs and Medicare and Medicaid, and limited housing options. So if the goal is to be offering more opportunities to individuals who've been incarcerated, this is obviously not going to do that. It's just perpetuating the prison industrial complex. So the impact of criminalization on marginalized communities specifically. As I said, this perpetuates the prison industrial complex and perpetuates structural inequality. Those without access to indoor working conditions are more likely to be incarcerated. Police determine who looks like a worker. So as I said before, they're more likely to target workers of color and trans workers. Marginalized workers aren't afforded basic human rights. So the right to dignity, the right to safety, the right to employment, either as a sex worker or in another job that requires a criminal background check. So sex trafficking legislation. A lot of the language that has been used previously for the war on drugs is being repurposed for the war on sex work. So as the war on drugs is being scaled back, it's being replaced with this anti-trafficking propaganda. So the new war is mirroring the old one in its idea that you have to lock up en masse the people creating the problem rather than examine any ways of reducing harm or looking at root causes. The anti-trafficking organizations have major political sway and are in fact not anti-trafficking organizations at all. They are anti-sex work, full stop. So, sex trafficking propaganda. The problems with sex trafficking propaganda are that they are conflating sex work and sex trafficking, which are two different things. So it's treating all workers as victims, regardless of their sense of agency and consent to be doing the work. It's also perpetuating racist stereotypes and assumptions. It's maintaining a singular narrative of what it means to be a part of the sex trade. And it takes a moralistic view on sex work as inherently wrong, undesirable, and to be eradicated. So I want to show you a few images, and I want you to take these in and think about the story that this is painting. So I'd love to hear from some of you about what you observed there. What was the perceived race of the people in those images? Predominantly white. Except, yes. So they're painting a picture that the victims of sex trafficking, and the person in the back said, except for one of the hands. The hand is a person of color. So it's perpetuating this idea that victims are white, helpless children or young women, and that the perpetrators of sex trafficking are men of color. Yep. Oh. Thank you. Yep. There's one up here. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So what the person in the audience was saying is that it's perpetuating this sort of stranger danger, that there's someone hiding in the bushes who's going to come out and grab you, and that's how sex trafficking works. Whereas we know the realities are much more complex than that. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add? If you feel like standing up, you're welcome to come to the mic. Otherwise, I'll just repeat or paraphrase what you say. Yeah, so the person in the audience was talking about how it's perpetuating capitalistic notions and commodifying the commodification of bodies rather than the actual service that's being provided. Did that sound accurate? Yep. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. All right. So with that as the backdrop, and this is what a lot of people are receiving as their only message of what sex trafficking is, it's unsurprising that a law like Sesta Fosta passed, especially because it's called Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act for SESTA and allow states and victims to fight online sex trafficking. That all sounds well and good until you understand it. So this was passed in the House on February 27th. It was passed in the Senate on March 21st of this year, and on April 11th, it was signed into law. And it had a huge amount of support. It was 388 to 25 in the House, and I think 97 to 2 in the Senate. So what this law is doing is it is changing Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which provides immunity from liability to websites that host third-party content. So Sesta Fosta amends 230 to retract this immunity in cases related to sex trafficking. Very vague language. So what does this actually mean? Online platforms that host third-party content are liable for user activity that knowingly facilitates sex trafficking. And sites that are used to promote or facilitate sex work can be charged with federal crimes. So there's obviously a disconnect between what is being claimed as the law and how it's going to be used versus the reality. So this law is claiming that it stops sex trafficking by removing online platforms and that it creates accountability for sites profiting off of sex trafficking. But what's actually happening is the law is conflating sex work and sex trafficking, and the law is stripping sex workers of access to integral harm reduction resources. So why is this so important for sex workers? Well, before we can talk about that, we need to understand how the internet is used by sex workers as a harm reduction tool. Online advertising. Online advertising allows workers to move away from street-based work, which makes them less vulnerable. If they're working indoors, they're going to be less vulnerable. It also offers workers more agency and control over their working conditions. So there are lower rates of HIV and STI transmission when you are able to control those conditions and when you're able to screen your clients and understand and use safer sex materials. I don't know why it's set on a timer, so I apologize for that. And it empowers sex workers to screen their clients, which results in lower rates of violence. There are also online community forums, and these offer social support, which decreases isolation for those who are in this line of work. It also creates a sense of community, places, and a place for folks to vent and solicit advice. It also is a place where individuals can receive safety tips for vetting, condom use, HIV and STI transmission information, testing and treatment information, and handling and avoiding dangerous clients. So since its passage, and this is a very limited list, I don't want to include sites that are still being used elsewhere or sites that are limited because I don't want people to know what those ones are. But these are some of the few sites that are advertising sites, screening sites, and community forums that are just closed. So folks were relying on all of these, and then all of a sudden they weren't there. This has also impacted other online spaces. Google Play has a new term of service that bans apps that support escort services. Google Drive has been deleting explicit content without informing its users. FetLife has changed its terms of service, saying that it will shut down profiles of pro-doms and subs who appear to be offering any sexual services. Twitter has been shadow banning sex worker accounts, so it's making them less viewable to users, and you can't search for that person. Skype has been updating its policy to prohibit profanity, nudity, and nudity, which forces cam workers off of this platform. So, how is this impacting marginalized communities? It is exacerbating racial and economic disparities in working conditions because many of these sites that were shut down were free or low-cost sites. It is pushing them offline and making sex workers more vulnerable to arrest, police harassment, and violence. And there's also been a huge influx in pimps and dangerous clients preying on sex workers who've been pushed off of these platforms. It is also making it community-based programs less effective because it limits the amount of information they're able to disseminate to communities, including bad date lists. And knowledge of workers' limited options emboldens clients to demand sex without condoms or other types of risky sexual behavior that sex worker might not typically offer. And survival sex workers are thus at a higher risk of HIV and other STI transmissions because they're being pressured to do things that they might not want to do but that are necessary for them to live. There's also been a huge spike in violence, and I tried to find more updated information than this, but it was difficult. It's very difficult to, this is the community is doing this work on its own, and there's a lot of grief happening right now, so I think folks aren't updating things as much as would be helpful here. But as of April 25th, which was just like 2 weeks, a week and a half after this law passed, there were 13 reports of missing or dead workers and at least 2 confirmed dead. And there have been numerous reports of assault and rape. So here is some of what folks have been saying about how this has been impacting their lives. These are all sex workers. FOSTA has created a playground for predators. That's Arabelle, who's 29, in California. This bill is killing us. We can't screen clients like we used to, which is what was keeping us safe. It's forcing me to go back to the streets, walking up and down, trying to find clients. They want us out of sight, underground, dead, or in the streets, easy to arrest. So, if we've learned anything from the war on drugs, it's that prohibiting something doesn't make it go away. It actually makes things more dangerous. So a 2011 study looked at gun violence and homicide rates for areas that had high drug law enforcement, and it found that the existing evidence base suggests that gun violence and high homicide rates may be an inevitable consequence of drug prohibition, and that disrupting drug markets can paradoxically increase violence. So if we can learn from this, disrupting sex trade markets will likely increase violence against sex workers themselves. So what are some other models outside of criminalization that countries are using to address sex workers? There is the Nordic model, also known as the abolition model or neo-abolitionism, depending on who you ask. In this model, buying sex is illegal, but not providing sex as a service. And the goal here is to abolish sex work. So it claims that it cuts demand by criminalizing clients of sex workers rather than the workers themselves. Countries that utilize this model include Sweden, where it was originated, Iceland, France, and I believe South Korea. Again, the language is really confusing, so if you type in Nordic model, it will say on some sites that these folks and these countries use it. Other sites will say it's something else. So this is as good as I was able to get. So why is the Nordic model problematic? So many ways. So it increases social stigma and discrimination against sex workers. It sends the message that society will not tolerate sex workers. It's perpetuating the idea of eradicating sex work rather than treating people with dignity and respect. It also strips sex workers of agency. It's perpetuating a sole narrative that all workers are victims, similar to the sex trafficking legislation. The Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women notes that demand-based approaches fail to acknowledge migrants and workers' own demands, motivations, aspirations, resistance strategies, and recommendations. And it compromises sex worker safety. So it's decreasing the ability to report violent clients for fear of losing other clients, and it interferes with screening processes. So for example, it reduces negotiation time for street-based workers because they want to move their client to a space where they can engage in whatever sexual activity they're going to. It also limits access to quality health care. In this model, it's incentivizing human service professionals to withhold comprehensive health care unless sex workers agree to stop working or to enter into programs to stop their sex work. Another model is legalization. In this type of situation, sex work is legal, but it is a highly regulated industry. So there are strict regulations on where, when, and how prostitution may take place. It is assuming a high level of access to resources, capital, and citizenship for sex workers. In the United States, the legalization model is used in certain counties in Nevada, but you must be licensed and work for a licensed brothel. And these brothels are located far away from the general population, which gives you a sense of how our country feels about sex workers. And countries that utilize this model include the Netherlands, Japan, Germany, and Finland. So what's wrong with the legalization model? It places often burdensome regulations on sex workers. As I was saying before, regulations on becoming licensed, working for certain licensed brothels, forced STI testing, which often is at the cost of the sex workers, so they have to pay for all of these things. It criminalizes those who don't or cannot comply. So, of course, it's also going to be disproportionately impacting marginalized communities, lower income workers who can't afford to get licensed or might not understand the paperwork for folks who don't speak the national language. Workers who have disabilities or workers without documentation and citizenship. It pushes all of these folks deeper into the shadows, and it perpetuates dangerous working conditions for those who cannot comply. So what would we like instead? Decriminalization. So, how is decriminalization different than legalization? We will get into that in a moment. But the decriminalization model treats sex work like any other type of work. So there are no laws specifically against sex work and no laws specifically regulating sex work, but sex work is still regulated by laws that would impact any other type of job. In addition to sex workers' support, this model is recommended by such organizations as Amnesty International. So this is something that has been demonstrated to have benefits for sex workers, and it is what we are saying we want. Countries that utilize this model include New Zealand and New South Wales, Australia. So New Zealand was the first place to fully decriminalize, and it's been over 10 years, so we have some research on the benefits. Like I said before, I was going to talk about the difference between legalization and decriminalization. So legalization means the regulation of prostitution with laws regarding where, when, and how prostitution can take place, whereas decriminalization eliminates all laws that prohibits the state and law enforcement officials from intervening in any prostitution-related activities or transactions unless other laws apply. Does that make sense to folks? Awesome. All right, so what are some of the benefits of decriminalization? First, it offers sex workers the right to self-determination. It takes into account their needs, their desires, and their goals. It also offers them the ability to organize and benefit from labor rights laws. It gives them the ability to report violence without fear of legal repercussion. It has led to lower rates of STI and HIV transmission and decreased incidence of sexual assault. So both of those two are from a study that was actually done when, from 2003 to 2009, Rhode Island accidentally decriminalized indoor sex work. And it worked out great until people noticed. But during that time, there was a decreased incidence of sexual assault as well as lower rates of STI and HIV transmission. So there was a study done on the impact of that. So that's within the U.S. And benefits that have been shown in New Zealand have been less violence against sex workers because they can report and they can screen their clients safely. It offers workers more control over their work environment. So back to the human rights framework of access to safety, access to health. And it offers workers legal, employment, occupational, and safety rights. We're also recommending decriminalizing any legislation that criminalizes having HIV or AIDS. So removing all this legislation and replacing it with a harm reduction service model instead. So some of these services might include free safer sex supplies, free or low-cost HIV testing, treatment, and counseling, needle exchange programs, education about and providing individuals who are interested with pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. So how can you all support sex worker rights? You can educate yourself and stay informed. Reading blogs is going to be the best way. I tried to find a little bit from academic journals, but honestly, they're not interested in sex worker voices a lot, and it's also tends to be outdated information. So blogs are a really great place, and I'll give some resources at the end. Finding grassroots organizations in your community or communities that are led or organizations that are led by community members, so sex workers who are providing services for sex workers. You can volunteer at these organizations. You can attend their meetings. Oftentimes they're engaged in political action, so you can join in that political action. You can use your position of power within the field of sexuality to amplify sex worker voices. So actually ask sex workers what their needs are, especially if you're creating organizational policies that impact them. Vote, lobby, and donate to support sex worker-friendly policies because money does talk. Unfortunately, we're in a capitalistic society, and your vote does really count, but lobbying and money is where it's at. All right, so I think I'm actually doing very well on time, so we're going to have some longer discussion. But I'd like you at your tables, if you are at a table by yourself and don't feel like moving, that is fine. If you are willing to move and join another table, that would be wonderful. But I want you to consider your own professional roles and your own socio-political identities, as well as the positions of power and privilege that you personally hold, and consider what one step might be that you could take to support sex workers based on your positionality within the field. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to discuss, and then if folks are willing to have a representative come up and share, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, I'm happy to just repeat back so folks who are watching online are able to see. And I welcome folks at home to also consider this. Maybe take a moment, grab a piece of paper, jot down some ideas, think about how you can participate in this. Are folks able to ask questions on Facebook? Have there been any questions? All right, just checking. 6 people? Since we're making good time, I might give them a little more time to talk. So if folks at home are patient with that, that'd be wonderful. I'm going to be just allowing for questions after this. So if anyone wants to sign off, that is also totally fine. I'm going to give folks about 5 more minutes. So if anyone hasn't answered and still wants to, I encourage you to do so. For anybody just joining, we're just discussing the prompt that's up here. Consider your own professional roles and sociopolitical identities and the position of power and privilege that you hold, and thinking about one step that you can take to support sex workers based on your positionality in the field. ask folks to finish up what they're saying, and we'll get back, regroup. Got a few more folks sharing over there, so I'm going to give them their space to do that. Thanks for everyone who's still with us. Oh, yeah, that's no problem. I'm just talking to the people who are watching, not you. So folks are just discussing the prompt that's up there. You're welcome to join in. And just so you're aware, we're live streaming, so I'll be like talking to the screen over here. All right. I think we're going to group back up, and I'd be happy to hear more of the conversation that you've been having. I can hear a little bit from over here, and it sounds like it's been a really wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate everybody who's been speaking up. I can't hear out of that mic from here.
But it should work now.
Oh, perfect.
I could just briefly summarize what we talked about. One of us is an OBGYN and felt that it was very important to educate the medical community. Another person focused on it's really important to begin to build better alliance from different group connections she's involved in. Another person felt it was really important to be a witness. She felt in her community to even witness and normalize for the person she was speaking with would be very, very powerful. And another person spoke about using a progressive church to fundraise for, it's a local church, so we could fundraise for HIPS.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for sharing. And it sounded like you were having some other discussions as well. So we will have a lot of time, probably in like just a minute. I'm going to open up to questions and comments. So I'd really invite folks who've been talking about the nuances. I overheard a little bit of discussion about nuances of, you know, what is exploitation and what is choice. And I think that those are really important conversations for us to have. And we have some time and space to do that. So I'm very happy to engage in those conversations as part of this workshop. All right. So these are some of the resources that I used in my presentation. I have a much more exhaustive list that I have my business cards, so if anybody wants more information or wants me to send them any of these articles, I would be more than happy to do that. I need to double check. Some of them might have copyright, but for the ones that don't, I can send those along. And at the bottom, this site, they have said that they are no longer going to be updating it, but Survivors Against SESTA, for me personally, was just a really beneficial way to educate myself about SESTA and FOSTA and its impacts. So I still think that it's a valuable resource. But some of the ones I was mentioning in here are All Pain, No Gain. So this is specifically about the impact of HIV criminalization in Pennsylvania. The Ending and Defending Against HIV Criminalization. Again, this is Pennsylvania focused, but information about HIV law and policy if you're more interested in that. The impact of using condoms as evidence for prostitution. So this is a study done in New York City, but it can also apply to any state or local government that is implementing this policy. This I found actually one of the most helpful things, because the Nordic model versus legalization versus decriminalization, depending on who you ask, there isn't just a singular definition of all of these things. So for me, it was really, really helpful to use the Smart Sex Workers Guide to challenging the introduction of the Nordic model. It gives a lot of really great comprehensive information about the Nordic model specifically. Then A Decade of Decriminalization is about sex work being decriminalized in New Zealand. So it's been over 10 years now. And so this was discussing the impact that that's had on sex worker communities. All right, like I said, just a minute. So if anyone has any questions or wants to have a more thorough discussion about some of the things you've been talking about at your table, I absolutely welcome that. And yeah.
Are there any organizations, communities in support of sex work clients? Or is everyone too afraid to come out and say, hey, I support it, I'm a client, and I don't want you to take away my right?
So I know that that has been something that sex workers have encouraged clients to do as part of, potentially just supporting them as an individual worker. I'm unsure about any organizations specifically are you talking about created by clients for this specifically, or just involving clients? Yeah, so I think that that's a great question, and if anyone here knows of any, I encourage you to share that. I am not personally aware, but I think that, the more folks we can have in support of sex worker rights, the better. And I think that, clients do offer an important perspective, especially in terms of the benefits that they receive from receiving sex worker services. So I think that that could be a valuable voice to have. I would just, caution about overpowering sex worker voices themselves. Because I think that the focus does need to be on the sex workers, but clients should be supportive. I think that that's great if they are in a space where they're able to come out and do that.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Have any religious denominations or organizations come out in support of legalization or decriminalization?
One of the articles that I just mentioned, which was specifically for New Zealand, was written by someone who was a part of Christ Church. I'm not sure specifically of religious denominations like within the U.S. that are being vocal about that, but I know that a lot of just human rights organizations in general that might have religious groups involved in them have been very vocal about the benefits of decriminalization versus other models. So Amnesty International might have some more information about religious organizations that are involved, but I'm happy to also look that up. If you want to shoot me an email, I will give you my business card at the end. Anyone else? like I said, it doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment. It can be something you want to correct that I might not have presented in the way that you would like me to. I'm very open to any and all of that.
Since I still have the mic, I think you did a really terrific job of making much clearer for me personally the differences between legalization and decriminalization and the Nordic model and the really bad system that we currently have. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate everyone who's been here. Do folks want to have a conversation a little bit about the nuances of exploitation and choice? Awesome. So would you like to start that off, or would you like me to lead that? How would you like to do that? Okay. Yeah, we got some time. Awesome. Okay, so my thoughts to begin with are that it is very difficult to be able to assess whether sex work is a choice for someone when it is happening within a capitalistic society, because there are, a lot of systems in place that burden folks to, be able to make a certain amount of money to pay for things that, in my opinion, should be covered by the government. So accessing, healthcare, housing, things along those lines, I think that it is very difficult to navigate what choice actually means. I do think that, and I think I overheard someone over there saying that it can be beneficial to start off talking about the polar ends of, consensual sex work and then what sex trafficking is. I think that it is very important to have those two things be distinct, because a lot of folks, when they're learning about a new topic, we want to think about things in a binary way. So if we can start off that conversation in a way that is accessible to folks, and then once they understand those two concepts, be able to talk about the nuances from there. So I would agree with the person who I overheard say that. So what are some things that you'd like to add to that conversation? You can either say it on the mic, or you can sort of shout it at me and I'll repeat it into the mic over here. I know mics can be intimidating. I'm very intimidated right now by this microphone. So.
Well, I brought it up before that we were talking about the conflation of sex work with sex trafficking, and how difficult it is for people who think of the decisions that they make as
as part of sex work?
Backing up a little bit, I think it's weird that my grandmother, who is in her 70s, would not look at her life and the decisions that she made to stay with men that were abusive to her children as, as being trapped and as trafficking, when she did it for security and financial security. Mm-hmm. That it bothers me, and I find it so confusing how someone from a different generation can look at the decisions that they made, to keep themselves safe in certain ways, maybe not in others, mm-hmm. in certain ways, and see it as that different from what someone walking down the street is doing. Mm-hmm. It really confuses and frustrates me. But then I also see it getting confusing and frustrating, like when we were watching the Love After War film last night. And there was the woman that stated very clearly that she saw this violent behavior from her husband as abuse. She saw that it was abusive, and she was making a decision to stay with him. And to me, that reads as agency. Mm-hmm. To know that something bad is happening, to know that you're making the decision, to know that you could make other decisions. Maybe they don't feel very accessible, but neither does where you are. Mm-hmm. And but one of those, a comment that someone made was about thinking that the women in the film didn't have very much agency. And I was really frustrated with that, because I feel like that really devalues the decisions that people make, the decisions that women make to stay in relationships with men, even if they're beneficial for them in ways that other people just don't think are worth the trouble. I don't know. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I think there's a lot of really valuable things to unpack with that. I think that going back to you said your grandmother, not necessarily wanting to associate with the term sex worker. I think that there's a really important conversation that can be had around agency of like, this is something I do. And some people who engage in sex work don't call themselves sex workers, and some do. And it is meant to be a term of empowerment. But similarly to my philosophy about folks who've been sexually assaulted, if they're not defining that experience that way for themselves, who am I to tell them that that's what happened? And I'm not saying, your emotions around that are invalid in any way. But I think that it is really complicated because you can have your perspective on that and all of the things that you've learned in your life. But someone, especially hearing the term sex worker and not knowing what that means, in addition to all of the stigma and discrimination that sex workers face, we have like a very singular narrative of sex work as well as sex trafficking. And so it makes it really difficult for folks to say, I am a sex worker, when there isn't an opportunity for them to define that for the person that they're saying it to. Or if someone else is saying, well, you're doing sex work, like that might be true, but it also might be something that can be damaging to them to either hear, or damaging to their perception of themselves or their perception of how they interact with the world. It can also, I think, I lost my train of thought, but along those lines. And then you were talking, so I didn't see the film last night. I was finishing this presentation. But I did speak with my my hotel mate here about it. So I think that that goes back to what we're talking about with the harm reduction model. You need to meet folks where they're at. So if folks are not identifying as in a situation that is abusive, or they are identifying that but are choosing to be in that position, what are other ways that we can support them in that decision? And I think that that's really important also for sex work. So if we're taking that to sex work specifically.
That's 100% what I want.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I feel like people are immediately willing to...
Do you mind speaking
Sorry.
into that?
I feel like people are immediately willing to be like, oh, this person's in a bad situation, they should do this, they should do that. But I feel like when they do that, they're not really thinking of it as agency. They think this person needs to do something else. They have to. They don't have other options because I see their bad decision and their bad situation, and they need to get out of there or they're going to die. And so even though they don't really see them as having agency, and they think whatever the next decision is, it had to be made. And I lost where I was going with that.
Well, I think that ties also into folks who aren't sex workers speaking for sex workers. Like, if you're not hearing where a person is at and what they want to do with regard to, risky sexual behaviors, or if they are using sex work as a way to pay for drug use, those folks are where they're at, and it's our duty to actually just meet them where they're at and not try to push our views of the world onto those folks. Did you want to add to what they were saying? Oh, I thought you had raised your hand. Oh, was that? Oh, okay. Stretching? Okay, perfect. All right.
I also just wanted to add that in regards to talking about speaking for people, it's very important to remember that there are people at different levels of sex work. There are those that are on the street. There are those that are in the house. Those that are, that are able to work, off the streets can't speak for those that are working on the streets, or those that are working to feed their families, those that may be working for, a drug addiction. So a lot of times I see, people that are speaking in regards to, that are can be put up as the face for sex work, but they're not necessarily speaking for those women who are, out on the streets because they are trying to feed their family, or because they have battling a drug addiction. So it's really unfortunate because policies are sometimes being made in which they're not going to benefit those women who are on the ground, because they're going to benefit, the pretty face in the street. So I hope that can, change a bit, that we remember that there's a certain amount of privilege at every level of sex work. But,
yeah, and that is absolutely, absolutely true. And I, am someone who is very privileged in the type of work that I do. And I try to be, as mindful as possible. But who's up here right now? I am very privileged. I had access to education. I had access to financial resources. So I definitely cannot speak for other communities. And I think that, in the future, I would like to see, I was supposed to have a co-presenter, but I'd like to see more folks who are from, especially the community that I'm working with, be able to have their voices heard, because it's unfortunate that I'm the one who's up here talking about this and that no other voices are being mentioned right now.
Okay, so apologies in advance for this being like super unorganized and like not very articulate, but I feel like it's so easy having these conversations to like get into this like super meta kind of cyclical dilemma where, you can't figure out how to balance the need for like recognizing individual agency as well as the real like forces like living in a capitalist society, for example, that are exploitative and kind of rob us of agency in so many ways. But I just fear that, I don't know, maybe not focusing our conversations more on like how to have a like proactive like solution to the problem is kind of an issue. But I'm really glad then that you focus more on like harm reduction, meeting people where they're at, kind of like not prescribing a solution for people, like not speaking over people, not speaking for people that you don't have I don't know, in situations that you don't have like personal experience. But what was I gonna say? Yep, lost my train of thought, but there's that.
Okay. And I'm definitely open to hearing more solutions as well. I think that is really important, that, there are practical solutions that we're talking about, and that it isn't just in this like theoretical bubble of Woodhull or wherever we're at. Because I think conferences are absolutely amazing in a lot of ways, but if we're not taking that information and implementing it somewhere, then it's going to waste.
So I was thinking about history a little bit and thinking about the Homophile Society, which was an early gay rights group, and how they would go, and when they would march, they went very respectably, and they very much presented themselves as like, we're like you, we're very normal and respectable people, we just want rights. And there were a lot of people that were really mad at them, and some of them were gay and knew it, and some of them were gay and probably didn't really know it, didn't really understand what was going on. And I think that that's kind of connecting to that, like, wanting to give people agency, but feeling like we're not dealing with the systemics issue, that, like, I don't know, when you said something about not speaking for people, too, and I realized that it could come off that I was sort of like I was being very judgmental about my grandmother, because my grandmother is very judgmental about sex workers. And I don't know, it made me think about just, sometimes I want to proselytize to women in general, like, free yourself, own your own body. Mm-hmm. And some of them take it as like an attack, and you said, it could be hurtful to some of them. And sometimes I think that it can be hurtful and that could be dangerous depending on where they are. And sometimes I think that it could just be emotionally hurtful, but really they might actually really need to think about that. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I just wanted to think about it so that we can all be better. That's my opinion.
And I think you bring up a really great point about respectability politics and, who we're showing as the face, as someone else was mentioning, who are we showing as the face of who's the sex worker, who is marketable to be, placed on a pedestal as this is the representation of sex work. And it is oftentimes a person who makes rich, white, cis men feel comfortable. And it's incredibly unfortunate. And I think that we have a lot of work to do around that and around, like, why do we have to appease these people who are in positions of power? They don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. And how can we put other folks into that space and have them receive the same amount of respect as people who they see as a part of themselves, like who they can recognize as a human, should be expanded greatly. I don't know if that last sentence made sense, but...
You brought up capitalism earlier, which is a great thing that you brought it up, because it looks like the newest, the millennial generation, I guess we're calling, doesn't have the same knee-jerk reaction. They just haven't bought into all of the socialism bad, capitalism good propaganda as much. And so Bernie had a chance as a democratic socialist. Ocasio won in New York. And capitalism, as we know it, is increasingly less the system of choice, I think, for young people whose veil has come off and are looking seriously at what really happens. And do you see some hope there?
I do in some ways, but I will say I was definitely a big Bernie supporter myself. But if I'm not mistaken, he actually voted in support of Sesta Fosta. So I have some mixed feelings on that. And I don't know if he just, didn't do his research. I don't know what happened there, but it definitely left me feeling very disillusioned. So I think that there is definitely some hope, and I think that there is a lot of hope in our generation as well as other generations. I think that we, like sex workers in general, are incredibly resilient, as well as I think this generation is pretty resilient and are bringing up really important topics that a lot of them have been mentioned before, but a lot of them haven't. And I think that that's really important, that we're having open discussions and questioning things and institutions that might not have been previously questioned as loudly. All right. Is there, how much time do we have left? About 5? Okay, so I could take either one more question or comment. I know I've been facing over here, so I'm sorry. Were there any questions for folks on there? Can you repeat that a little louder? I can research that. Is that someone that I'll have access to communicating with? Okay. So for whoever is asking about organizations in Maine, I can get you that information. I need to look it up. I'm not from there, but I can certainly do that for you. All right. Any final thoughts or questions, comments, feedback? Positive or negative, I'm fine with that. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who watched. Anyone who has any further questions, I did bring business cards with me. I didn't include my contact information here, mainly because I don't want everyone in the world to have it. But I do have my business cards here. And I think that's the last one. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And I really appreciate your engagement and participation.